This is Susie Penman. It is December 11th, 2024, and I'm joined here with my colleague Brian Franklin. And we are here in Dallas on the campus of SMU to interview Richard Immerman as part of the Oral History of Walter LaFeber project. To begin with, can you just introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about who you are.
I am Richard Immerman. I am one of the more senior people involved in the Oral History Project and the entire LaFeber project. I am a retired historian from Temple University, where I directed the Center for the Study of Force and Diplomacy. I went to Cornell as an undergraduate, so I'm one of the 50% of those involved in it who was an undergraduate with Walt as opposed to a graduate. That is significant given his reputation as an undergraduate marvel, and as in so many cases, that course really set me on my career path. I went to, and I'm sure we'll discuss this more, I was at Cornell as an undergraduate during the heart of the Vietnam War, when the campus was an extremely exciting place to be, and studying U.S. foreign policy was an extremely exciting subject to explore. And then I, although not immediately afterward, went on to graduate school in a PhD and ended up in certain ways following in Walt's footsteps, but in other ways sort of going off on my own.
So can you take us back, if you can, to those undergraduate years? Tell us about when you first encountered or met Professor LaFeber. Those might be two different occasions.
Yes, well, they were different, and it was, I'm not going to say unorthodox, but somewhat different, I think, than most of us did. I went to Cornell as a government major. Cornell had a government department in contrast to a political science department, and that was, I think, indicative of its sort of approach. It was less theoretical than it was basically the histories of governments. And as such, I did not take any history my freshman year. We have requirements, and I took introductory courses in the government department, one of them being in U.S. history, U.S. government. But as I think was the case with so many of us, certainly by time of my second semester, or maybe it was my second year, I just kept hearing about this guy, Walter LaFeber, and his courses. And I heard it from government majors, from history majors, from others, because my courses were almost all in arts and sciences. And that's a feature of Cornell as well because of all the different schools. So in any case, I believe, so I never switched majors. I stayed a government major, but I took Walt's course, as did many of my friends, who by that time, most of my friends were like myself, very active in the anti-war movement. That was my little clique. I had two cliques. I had my anti-war cliques and I had my motorcycle riding cliques. There was some overlap, but not that much. So I used to go, I went to the survey courses, and I never took a seminar with Walt, which is one of my great regrets, but that was because of the major issue. But in any event, I would traipse up to his lecture course, usually with all of my friends, and we would listen as everyone else and be spelled by his lectures. And then afterward, almost every time, and we know that the lectures were Tuesday, Thursdays, and Saturdays, but so especially on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I don't remember so well on Saturdays, we would all, after the class, go back to this coffee house called the Temple of Zeus, which was right on the quad, where we would sit around and we would talk about Walt LaFeber's lectures. I would say that for me, that was a unique experience throughout my undergraduate, not just listening to those lectures, but the fact that we were like LaFeber groupies afterward, going back and talking about them. I met Walt, interestingly, I'd met him a couple times, but we had a conversation along with several people when we went to speak to Walt during, I think it was the second of the strike. It was after Cambodia and Cambodia and Kent State and all of that, when the students went on strike, and it's a big part of the book, and Walt did not. Walt kept talking. So had a long discussion with him. I didn't agree with him at that time, but it was very reasonable conversation. Subsequently, I think I've come to understand his position a lot better than I did at that point. But as I said, I was my involvement, my political activism at Cornell took precedence over my studies. And that was part of the reason that I came to know Walt much better after I graduated than I did at the time, as I became a historian of U.S. foreign policy. And we had many more personal conversations and interactions afterward than we did before, and it's sort of ironic that the longest face-to-face discussion we had was over my distress with his not going on strike over the war.
Do you mind telling us a little bit more about that conversation?
Well, I know now, I should go back, and I'm a little concerned, I'm not unsure of the chronology and when the strike was, because 2 out of the 4 years I went to Cornell, we did not hold finals because of protests. The first one had to do with when the African Americans took over the student union, the Straight. The second had to do with, which was more confined to Cornell. The second one was Kent State and Cambodia and everything that happened the following year. And I can't remember when the discussion took place. And I mention this because in the first one, I, just by serendipity, with 3 other people, were at the door of the student union when the African Americans brought in the guns. So we were the first people to see the guns. Mm. And I remember being so totally freaked out. I think that was not part of what the plan was, what the script was. I mention that because I don't recall Walt discussing the guns as a factor or a variable in his overall, his perspective on what was going on and the position that he took. It came up in different discussions we had that was very important to him, and I totally understand. But this idea that this had gotten out of hand, and we were, these were like young juvenile kids behaving in a way that just violated every precept that he had for a university. We did talk about academic freedom, and we did talk about the role of a university and his commitment to education, and that the behavior of the students really did not conform. He was not going to change his values, what he thought was most important, because of us. And as I said, At that point, my values had more to do with the war than they had to do with the educational enterprise to begin with. Over time, as I said, I learned to appreciate much more his perspective on that. I would still love to talk to him, particularly in the contemporary era, about how academic freedom fits into this overall framework of what it was. I mean, certainly shutting down other people's speech, that would be a violation. We didn't really do that at that point. But there were other issues, but that's really what we talked about, was sort of the role of the university and the role of academic freedom. And I think really, which was most important, which is what I really learned, is the whole notion of sort of civil discourse on a campus and at a university, something that I think we all lament has really almost evaporated now.
I want to go back to talking about his lectures. You talk about being so wowed that you and your friends would go to this coffee shop afterwards. Tell us about a Walt LaFeber lecture.
It's almost indescribable in a way. I mean, it's easy to describe and it's impossible to describe. There's nothing. It was dramatic without being dramatic. I mean, we all know we have professors who have booming voices, who I used to joke when I taught a large class, and this was a larger class than when I taught it, it was in Bailey Hall with 500 students. I mean, it was the largest class that Cornell, I think, offered. Any place, maybe Berkeley when you're outside, but in any event, it was huge. But I used to sort of joke, particularly in introductory course, which this was not, that I would do my Johnny Carson, then I would get out and I'd walk out to the audience. There was none of that, those sort of theatrics. And he didn't lecture in a monotone exactly, but it was pretty matter-of-fact conversation. But it was just amazing. I mean, because he would walk in, I mean, I'm sure that everyone has said this who took this course, he would walk in like, 14 seconds before the class was supposed to begin. And he would write an outline on the board, or sometimes, I can't remember, it might have already been on the board, but this was before the days of any sort of technology, so it literally was a chalkboard, a blackboard. And he would write an outline on the board, and then he would begin, and he would end incredibly on time. He would follow that outline so rigorously it was almost impossible that anyone could do that. I think all of us spent our lives trying to somehow replicate what Walt was able to do and never able to do it. I always put on outlines for him, and it was embarrassing because I never finished the outline, and then I would have to go over to the next class, and I kept thinking, I'm going to someday not do this, not to embarrass myself. But he never had to worry about that. No notes, except every now and again, which I'm sure he didn't need, near the end, he would take out a note card to read like a quote. But that was his drama. That was it. And then at the end he would say, and by way of conclusion, and then it would end. And you would, it was very difficult to take notes because you were so focused on him, and yet he was providing so much information that you'd be looking at him and you'd be scribbling. So it was always, I found my penmanship was not very good to begin with, and it was hard, but I would write down the outline and be able to follow the outline with my notes. And sometimes I would try to anticipate the spaces ahead of time so that it could work. Um, and then it was, it would be over, and then he would just get up and walk out. I mean, it was. I never experienced anything for it, and there was just so much. And he um, he would. They were humorous, but in a way that he would deliver these humorous lines, which were really hysterical, without changing his tone of voice. It was just like integrated into the conversation. And I don't think any of us who took the course really had much of a foundation in the history of U.S. foreign policy. I mean, we knew bits and pieces of it, but it was an advanced level course. But I know I'd only had like surveys before that, and he imparted so much information. And the other thing is that he did it in a very narrative way, in which he focused heavily on individuals, which was a very I thought, intelligible way to present it, and very engaging. In fact, decades later, I wrote a book on the American Empire, and that it was based on individuals. And at the beginning, I say that it was modeled after Walter LaFeber. I mean, the whole book was Walter LaFeber, the format and the use of empire, and sort of struggling to sort of make sense of what that was.
Well, that leads perfectly into my next question, which is how have you interacted with LaFeber's work over the years? And so that's one example.
Yeah, well, it was always there. So he was actually great in that I wrote my dissertation on the CIA intervention in Guatemala. And my advisors, I did my PhD at Boston College, and one of my original advisor who had died had been a LaFeber student. So that was part of the reason that I went there. And everyone discouraged me from writing this dissertation. I mean, really for two reasons. One was that all the material was classified at that point, so it was extremely risky to embark upon a project that would depend on declassifying those documents. But the job market was already lousy, so I was willing to take a risk. And secondly, I was really intrigued by this subject, which I knew nothing about, having taken all of these courses. So Walt encouraged me. I mean, I wrote him about it, and he did encourage me to do it. And this is before he wrote Inevitable Revolution. It's before he wrote his Panama Canal book. But those of us who knew of his interest in Latin America through the New Empire, I mean, it really was, in many ways, a Latin American-centric, of all of the ones. It wasn't the China market as much as it was. So in that sense, his work had always influenced me. And as I said, that it was on empire, and empire was, I think, very important to all of the students. And when I started teaching, it was one of those things that I spoke about. So I always engaged his work in many ways, but I didn't always. My arguments didn't necessarily mirror his. I mean, one of the things, and that was the thinking otherwise, is that he taught us to sort of go off on our own and to do. And I ended up dealing probably more with issues of security than he did. And after that first book, I got much more into that. I then came back to his work But as I say, this book, one of my last books, called Empire for Liberty, was almost an ode to Walter LaFeber in many ways, which I'd been thinking about, really for decades, and developed a course around it, and actually wrote the book after I had developed the course, which had to do with essentially the rise of the American empire and tracing it. So he was always on mind, and methodologically as well, not just in terms of that. I remember, I don't know if this was by design, but Walt was actually one of the readers of my first book, which was a great thrill. I'm sure that was by design by the editor. They wanted to do the book, so they had two people who read it who would both give good critiques in that. But one of Walt's critiques, and remember, I was not a graduate student of his, I was an undergraduate, is that I had, in the original draft, were extensive discursive footnotes. And I remember Walt wrote this critique, and he says he believes very strongly that if something doesn't warrant inclusion in the text, it doesn't warrant inclusion in the book. And not only did I follow that forever, but I taught all my students that. And when we did Thinking Otherwise, and I was an editor, I made all of our contributors take out all of those long footnotes. So I just use that as an example of his continuing influence in just so many different ways. From, certainly the teaching, and that's where that was the most aspirational part of my entire career, was to aspire to be a professor like Walter LaFeber, knowing that I would never get there, but you keep striving to do it. And that everything that he had taught, both in terms of contending with his arguments, and just methodology, the types of things that he taught us over the years, including the value of good prose.
And you've talked about how your relationship with him really strengthened after you were an undergraduate. Can you talk about how it developed?
Yeah, very much so. And I can give little anecdotes. And in there I told about when we went to baseball games together. But
I would love to hear you talk about going to baseball games.
Well, it's only one, but it was a big point in my life, and I'll get to that. But so Walt didn't like to go to conferences particularly, but he did, and I would say that one of sort of the turning points in our relationship is, well, let me just provide a tiny bit of context. Is my first job was at Princeton, and when I was at Princeton, I came to know and become good friends with a number of good friends of Walt's. And I got to know them no longer as a student, as a professional in my own right, although a very, very junior one. Two of the people specifically were Marty Sherwin, who was at Princeton, and more significant in terms of Walt was Lloyd Gardner. And Lloyd Gardner, to this day, and I are very, very close friends. I was advised, and I think it was by Marty, to begin to go out the world and to propose a panel on sort of CIA in Latin America for, I believe it was the meeting of the Organization of American Historians. And Marty said, why don't you ask Walt to chair it? If Walt chairs it, you're going to get the panel accepted. So I did, and Walt accepted it. We'd had some interactions before that. He would come and visit and that, so we knew each other. But the panel was a fiasco. It was, again, it's in the middle of sort of Vietnam, or no, it's afterward. It was about I'm going to say 1980, something like that. So it's the middle of Central America, Reagan Central America. Things are blowing up. So I give my paper, which is on sort of the Guatemala thing. There's another paper on Guatemala thing. There's another one that has to do with Cuba. The audience couldn't care less about what we had said. They all had to get up and give their polemic about U.S., imperialism in Africa and Asia, and everything was going on. And Walt's the master of ceremonies in all of this. And he's just sort of said, I know, give up. So afterward, he came up to me and he said, I'm never, ever going to be chair of another session at that. So and it was as if he was speaking to me as a more of a friend and a colleague than, my former professor and my mentor. And he did it he always had this sort of sly grin on his face when he didn't. Lloyd Gardner has a, boisterous laugh. Walt was not that person. Everything was more restrained, including his smile, but it was a fabulous smile. So and so after that, we would meet on a number of different occasions, whether that, and we would talk, and by that point, I was more established. And then only a couple years later, and it's in the book, I think it might have been 1983, we went to that same meeting. The OAH was meeting in Cincinnati. And I was there, somewhat ironically, to get an award for the dissertation that I had written and then had been published, which Walt had encouraged me to write, but no one else had wanted me to write. I was at the University of Hawaii at this point, which also constrained how much personal interactions we would have. So I think we had dinner together, and then at some point Walt proposed that we go to a baseball game. And Lloyd was there, and Tom Patterson was there, and a couple other people. I think it had to do with his dinner. So in any event, it was the Cubs that were playing, and that was his team, and they were playing Cincinnati. Both teams were terrible. There was absolutely no reason to go to, and it was cold and damp, and we went to the game, and Gardner, who really doesn't like baseball, was complaining the whole time about the weather and all of that. And I was sitting next to Walt, and I'd been a really good baseball player, and I loved baseball. So they were just complaining, and we were just talking about X's and O's and all the things that was going on. And again, it sort of took our relationship. I think it just kept developing as I never, ever, ever considered myself sort of on a par with Walt. He would always be my professor, and he was also, no matter how successful I thought I got, there was always several rungs below. But, we could talk about it. He wasn't a gossip, but we would talk about other people in the profession, and he was always giving some sort of advice in some way or another, even if that wasn't sort of the intention. It would just sort of come out. I think that he felt his obligation almost to continue to serve as sort of our mentors, no matter how old we had gotten.
Who won the game?
I have no idea, but I'm pretty sure we stayed to the end, which often you don't do in a baseball game under any circumstances. But I just remember it. So I can even remember where we were sitting. That here we were, and Walt was next to me, and back here on the left was Gardner sitting next to Tom Patterson, and he just kept saying, "Why the hell are we here? Why, what are we doing? Why would anyone be here?"
So you've talked a little bit about this. But how do you think that LaFeber himself viewed his contribution to the field of U.S. foreign relations?
That's a really good question. Um, so I don't. Walt, of course, was probably, well, I wouldn't say probably. He was the most prominent member, and I'm not going to say disciple, of the Wisconsin School. And I'm going to include William Appleman Williams in that group of all of them. I mean, Williams and Writing the Tragedy might have been sort of the co-founder along with Fred Harvey Harrington, but the Wisconsin School became the Wisconsin School because of their students, particularly LaFeber, Gardner, and McCormick, and particularly LaFeber. He wrote those books that not only revolutionized the subfield, but at least throughout the 70s and into the 80s, maybe throughout the 80s until the end of the Cold War, became the dominant interpretive school in the subfield. And I never asked Walt, what role he thought, he played in that. But just the title of the book, The New Empire, was itself sort of signaled this historiographic change. I said revolution, but paradigm shift. And then his book on the Cold War was what we all read. I mean, and not just quote unquote revisionists. Everybody read that book. And when John Gaddis writes this very well-known article, Post-Revisionist Synthesis, which was garbage in a lot of ways, but he was basically challenging LaFeber's book. And then, as I said, along come people like Immerman, who begins this book on empire freedom by talking about how empire has now become part of the lexicon of historians of foreign relations, what it had never been before. That really begins with The New Empire as a title. There had been The Rising American Empire, and there had been other books, but that was the title that had it in. So Walt was very self-effacing, but he was also, he was self-confident. He knew what he was doing and where his place was. So I think that Walt was very conscious of the roles that he played, but what made it so much more interesting in a way in terms of that is that without minimizing the number of graduate students Walt mentored, it was not the number of other places. I mean, his contribution, what he's most known, was not because he created a number of, he mentored PhDs who went out and carried the Walt LaFeber banner. It was really through his undergraduate teaching and his publications that he did this, which is not the conventional ways in which, so when we talk about the Wisconsin School, it's the graduate school students that came out. I know a lot of people. I had more graduate students than Walt LaFeber did, but I never had the influence on the field that Walter LaFeber did. I could go through other places like that. So, and I think one of the reasons, it wasn't the primary reason, but that Walt nurtured Russia and America in the Cold War so much, went through the 9, I guess finally 10 different editions, but that he rewrote the whole thing almost every time, is that that was, with all of his other books that he wrote, that was the book that I think he thought was most representative of where he fit into sort of the field, even though I could make the case that the New Empire and then his contribution to the Cambridge history was where he laid out his most, how do I put it? His intervention was the most profound historiographically.
I think this question for you is particularly interesting because of you describing your involvement in campus politics. But several participants in these interviews have noted that LaFeber would not have enjoyed being labeled a scholar activist. But many people have called him that.
Yeah.
How do you think he might have viewed that label?
I agree. In fact, initially in one of the essays, one of our authors used that, and as editor, I said I didn't like it, and I said that he would not have liked it at all. He didn't. I think he really. So I'll say two things, which is because I remember having dinner with him in Hawaii, a number of years later, and he was lamenting that the Cornell campus lacked the intellectual stimulation and excitement that it had when I was there. That students were more complacent, they were more placid, that there wasn't, it wasn't simply that there was a decline in the number of people taking as students, but to continue sort of our conversation, the students weren't going down to the Temple of Zeus afterward and discussing his course, and then using that as a starting point to talk about the world in general and what was going on, which in our case was Vietnam, but by this point, as I said, Central America had sort of blown up, and in many ways, because of inevitable revolutions, Walt's scholarship was more central to that than it had been to Vietnam, even though he wrote on Vietnam, but not in a book like Inevitable Revolutions. But he did not, as I said, he had real problems with sort of activists, in part because I think he didn't think we fully understood the role of the university and the education in civil society and in American political culture, and how important this type of education was. So his activism came through his writing and through his lectures and through his educating and informing a citizenship. He was a real patriot in that sense. In our chapter in Thinking Otherwise, Eric Alterman and I write about that, because we did The Deadly Bet, which was on Vietnam. It was the closest he ever read to doing a whole book on Vietnam, even though he did various aspects of it. There he sort of takes aim at he doesn't deal with student activists as much as one might think, and I think part of that is that he was uncomfortable in a way with that. He was aware, I think, that he, in a certain sense, he encouraged student activism. He certainly did mine. What I learned in that class, I translated into my own politics, despite what maybe he would have liked that I did. When I wrote, I've been accused of presentism. I wrote about that in the chapter. I think he was presentist in the best sense of the word. I'm not sure I was, certainly at that age. And I think it's the one conversation I would have loved to have had with him, which would have been a very personal conversation. And I would explain after that conversation we had why it was so difficult for me to understand his position as a 18 or 19-year-old at Cornell University with this war raging around me, and listening to his lectures and learning about the history and learning about the tragedy of American diplomacy and why we were in Vietnam. And for him to say how, and he almost left Cornell, at that point, whether he was at all uncomfortable with knowing that unintentionally he contributed to behavior on my part that he really objected to. It's really sort of a fascinating, almost paradox, I think, that went on, that we don't bring out and did not come out in many of our discussions, because the discussions overall that we had to do with Walt's decision not to strike and to keep teaching that. It did not have to do with necessarily his personal interactions with those people who were striking and couldn't fully understand what he was doing. And then afterward, many of us went on to, into different positions and I've been thinking an awful lot of it now because of what happened in terms, I'm very close to University of Pennsylvania campus and everything that happened over Gaza. And I can just imagine how Walt would have reacted to what was going on, which to me was a clear exemplar of the tension between academic freedom and political protest on a campus.
Mm-hmm. Is there anything I haven't asked you? I mean, I'm sure there's plenty you could share, but anything you want to share in this moment?
Well, yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to do with a question, but it has to do with it. Walt, I think Walt, for many of us, was sort of a model of what a professor was all about. The care, attention, and sensitivity that he manifested with every student, no matter who it was. How he had time, I have no idea, because, I know now way more of that. I mean, the time pressures that students can put on, and granted, this was before email, but nevertheless, as I said, that I wasn't as close to him as an undergraduate as some who he was his advisors or whatever it is, but that in no way deterred or constrained him from offering me advice afterward, and then taking on the role that he should have had to begin, which was my mentor. There was a certain dignity to Walt that was just so natural. It was just who he was. There was a restraint, I think, that some people probably, until they got to know him, saw as sort of standoffishness. I don't know. I'm sure some people even thought it was a certain amount of, arrogance or something. That was just not Walt. He was, and as I said, he was just always temperate and, I said, gentlemanly, and I don't use that word very often, and in almost any context. We joked, and I did it with Jeff before. we decided up in Ithaca that when we would have our picture taken and we would all go, they said, what should we wear? And we said, well, we'll all wear a tie and jacket in honor of Walt, because he always wore a tie and jacket. Now, even in those days at Cornell, there were those who did not. But I think that was part of what Walt saw as sort of the professional historian. And so there we did it. And I remember Suzanne, his daughter, smiling because she knew exactly what we were doing. So when I saw Jeff last night, I said, you know, I'm going to wear a tie and jacket for this interview. And he said, really? He said, I hadn't thought about it. I said, well, we should. I mean, we've all been doing it from the beginning. So I said, I can't emphasize enough how much he influenced, and I know this was not just for me, sort of my entire sort of bearing as a professional historian and a scholar, and how I would behave at conferences. And you know, he was the model. He was the one who, you know, and it was harder for me. You know, he was like, what, 6 inches taller than I was, and he always had this airing, so I looked like this little young kid in that. But, you know, so I would strive. I was going to be Walter LaFeber, so maybe it was even more important that he had that, because I had to become that person. I can actually, if you want, I can use this discussion as a segue into the story that I had with Jeff, because it shows who Walt LaFeber was. I didn't know who Jeff Engel was. He was a graduate student, and Jeff loved Philadelphia, and Katie did research in Philadelphia. So out of nowhere, Walt writes me that this student of Tom McCormick's, who had been is coming to Philadelphia, and what can I do for him? So he said he doesn't need much. So I said, well, I can do that. I can get him an office. I'll make him a visiting fellow of my center. He'll therefore have library privileges and you know, everything else. I didn't know Jeff Engel from a hole in the ground. Walt LaFeber asked me to do this. Of course I'm going to do it. I'm going to do it, one, because of Walt, but basically if Walt is recommending anyone, that's all I need to know that this is a person who I'm going to make whatever effort I am. So Jeff comes to Philadelphia. I set him up. We become, close friends, and in fact, I was at their wedding. But interestingly enough, that Jeff, and we sort of immediately shift into this role. Now Jeff is giving me chapters of his dissertation and is doing that. So I'm now becoming sort of the, I don't know what you want to call it, in this line of people. So Jeff worked with LaFeber, and then he worked with McCormick. Then he came and was doing that, but I read all of his stuff. So when he writes his Bush book, on the dedication, it's to Walt LaFeber, Tom McCormick, and Richard Immerman. But that was basically LaFeber, and he did 1 million of those all over the place. And we talked about it a lot in the project, because I knew about half of the people who were involved in it. And I knew them, one, because we were historians, but because we were Walt LaFeber students. And we became, friends because of that. And Frank Castigliola, Andy Rotter, and I have sort of become this like triumvirate. We're all around the same age. But he was like the glue that held us all together, even though, in that, we span close to 50 years in terms of students, I think that the earliest person who's in that began as an undergraduate with him in the 1950s. The last person is a PhD in the 1990s. That's quite a spectrum, which also explains why we didn't necessarily know each other, but that we came seamlessly to work together and that. But my point is that Tom McCormick, who I didn't really know at all, must have contacted Walt and said, "Do you know anyone in Philadelphia?" Walt said, "Of course I know someone," or not of course, "I know someone in Philadelphia." He wrote me. The next thing you know, Jeff Engel has a visiting fellow at our center.
And here we are.
And here we are. and of course, we've stayed very close ever since.
That's wonderful. Well, thank you so much. I think that's it, unless there's anything else you want to add.
No, I mean, I can't think of anything. I just will end that at the round table at the Schaefer thing that we did after Walt passed. They asked us to do a thing, and I just chaired it. And Frank and Ann Foster and Jennifer, I forget all the people who were on it. I think Lorena was on it. We got to the end, and it was the same type of thing. The question was, well, do you have any last comments? And I just said, yeah, Walt LaFeber changed my life. And I remember Jeff coming afterwards and says, God, I'm really glad you said that. So
Thank you.
that's a good way to end it.